Most wars end in years. The longer ones drag on for a decade, maybe two. But there is one conflict in recorded history that stretched across 781 years, long enough that the great-great-great-grandchildren of the soldiers who started it were fighting the same war their ancestors had. It began in the year 711, when an army crossed a narrow strip of water separating two continents. It didn't end until 1492, the same year a Genoese sailor convinced a Spanish queen to fund a voyage across the Atlantic. Between those two dates, an entire civilization rose, flourished, fractured, and was slowly pushed back across a peninsula. One kingdom, one border, one generation at a time. This is the story of the Reconquista, the longest continuous struggle for territory in human history. It's a story with no single villain and no side that stayed the same for 8 centuries. Kingdoms that started as enemies became allies. Warriors switched sides more than once. And for long stretches of those 781 years, the two civilizations at the center of this story didn't just fight each other. They built libraries together, traded with each other, and borrowed each other's ideas. By the end of this video, you'll understand exactly how a war that outlasted dynasties, languages, and entire empires finally came to a close. And why its ending, when it finally came, wasn't a battle at all. If you want the full picture without missing a single turning point, hit subscribe and turn on notifications now, because this channel breaks down history like nowhere else. You won't want to miss what's coming next. In the spring of 711, a force made up largely of Berber soldiers from North Africa, acting under the authority of the Umayyad Caliphate, crossed the narrow strait separating Africa from the Iberian Peninsula, the strip of land we now call Spain and Portugal. At the time, Iberia was ruled by the Visigothic Kingdom, a Christian successor state that had controlled the region for roughly 2 centuries, though one weakened by internal succession disputes that left it poorly positioned to respond to a sudden coordinated campaign. What followed was startlingly fast. Within a matter of months, the Visigothic king had fallen in battle near the Guadalete River, and the kingdom's centralized resistance effectively collapsed with him. Within just a few years, the vast majority of the peninsula had come under the control of the new arrivals, who pressed steadily northward with little organized opposition standing in their way. City after city negotiated terms rather than face prolonged sieges, and many local administrators simply continued running their towns under new overlords, a pattern that would repeat itself in reverse centuries later as the border began moving the other way. By 718, only a small, mountainous strip of territory in the far north remained outside their control, a rugged, unwelcoming region that simply wasn't worth the trouble of chasing down. It offered little in the way of farmland, wealth, or strategic value, and the effort required to fully subdue it far outweighed any benefit. So it was left alone. That sliver of unconquered land would turn out to matter more than anyone could have guessed. Tucked into those northern mountains was a small band of local nobles and soldiers, led by a figure named Pelayo. According to tradition, around the year 718, some sources say a few years later, this group won a small but symbolically enormous victory at a place called Covadonga, fending off an expedition sent to bring the mountain holdouts to heel. In practical military terms, Covadonga barely registered. It was a skirmish, not a campaign. But it gave the scattered Christian communities of the north something they didn't have the day before: a foothold, a leader, and a story worth telling their children. Out of that skirmish grew the Kingdom of Asturias. Tiny, yet poor, and surrounded, but independent. It was the first thread of what would become, over the next 7.5 centuries, the slow unraveling of control over the entire peninsula. Nobody involved in that mountain skirmish could have imagined they'd started something that wouldn't finish for another 774 years. Here's where the story gets more complicated than one side fighting the other for 8 centuries straight. What emerged in the territory under Umayyad and later independent Muslim rule, a region known as Al-Andalus, became one of the most advanced and cosmopolitan societies in the medieval world. Its capital, Córdoba, grew into one of the largest and most sophisticated cities in Europe, home to enormous libraries said to hold hundreds of thousands of volumes at a time when most of the rest of the continent could barely produce a few dozen manuscripts in a single monastery. Scholars in Al-Andalus worked in medicine, astronomy, mathematics, and philosophy, often building directly on classical Greek and Roman texts that had been lost or forgotten elsewhere in Europe and would later flow back into the wider continent through translations made in cities like Toledo. For long periods, Muslims, Christians, and Jews lived within the same cities, worked in the same markets, and in some cases collaborated on the same scholarly projects, a period historians often refer to as convivencia, or coexistence, even though that coexistence was never equal or free of tension, and the specific terms of it shifted considerably depending on the ruler, the city, and the century in question. Meanwhile, to the north, the small Christian kingdoms, Asturias, later joined by Leon, Castile, Navarre, Aragon, and the eventual Kingdom of Portugal, spent generations doing two things at once, fighting each other over territory and inheritance just as often as they fought southward, while slowly, unevenly, pushing their own borders further down the map. Royal marriages between these kingdoms were arranged and broken almost as often as military campaigns were launched, and more than one Christian king spent a portion of his reign fighting a fellow Christian monarch rather than the rulers of Al-Andalus. This is the part of the Reconquista that rarely makes it into the highlight reel. For most of its 781 years, this wasn't one long, unbroken battle. It was a patchwork of treaties, marriages, temporary alliances that crossed religious lines, and long stretches where the border simply sat still for a generation or two while everyone got on with ordinary life, farming, trading, and raising families who had never known anything other than the peninsula's uneasy shifting divide. The balance of power began shifting in 1031 when the Caliphate of Córdoba, the political center holding Al-Andalus together, collapsed into a patchwork of smaller, competing kingdoms known as taifas, each ruled by its own local dynasty and often more concerned with rivalries against neighboring taifas than with any unified defense of the peninsula. Divided and often at odds with each other, these smaller states were far more vulnerable than the unified caliphate had been. Christian kingdoms in the north took notice. Over the following decades, they expanded steadily, sometimes through military campaigns, sometimes by extracting tribute payments known as parias from weakened taifa rulers in exchange for peace, arrangements that could shift again within a single ruler's lifetime, depending on who held the upper hand that particular decade. It's in this period that one of the most famous figures of the entire Reconquista appears, a nobleman and mercenary commander known to history as El Cid. His story doesn't fit neatly into a simple narrative of one side against the other. Over the course of his career, he fought for Christian kings and Muslim rulers alike, depending on where his services were needed and who was paying. At one point, exiled from the Castilian court he had served, he spent years leading forces on behalf of a Muslim ruler in the taifa of Zaragoza before eventually carving out his own independent territory. His most famous conquest, the city of Valencia, was won while he was operating largely as an independent warlord rather than as a loyal servant of any single kingdom, ruling the city in his own name until the end of his life. Unworried by the growing Christian advances, Al-Andalus's taifa rulers eventually called in reinforcements from North Africa. First the Almoravid dynasty in the late 11th century, then later the Almohads in the 12th. Both arrived as unifying, often more rigidly religious powers that pushed back hard against Christian gains, and for a time reversed much of the momentum that had built up over the previous decades, retaking cities that had only recently changed hands. The war, in other words, didn't move in one direction. It surged forward, stalled, and occasionally reversed. For generation after generation, with no single ruler on either side able to claim they had settled the matter for good. The moment that finally broke the deadlock for good came in 1212, at a battle known as Las Navas de Tolosa. A coalition of Christian kingdoms, Castile, Aragon, Navarre, and Portugal, setting aside their usual rivalries for the occasion, with additional forces arriving from beyond the Pyrenees, joined together against the Almohad army in what became one of the most decisive engagements of the entire war. The Almohad defeat was severe enough that their power in Iberia never fully recovered. Within a generation, the Almohad state itself had fractured back home in North Africa, cutting off any realistic hope of the kind of reinforcement that had twice before turned the tide back in Al-Andalus's favor. In the decades that followed, Christian kingdoms surged southward at a pace the previous 500 years hadn't seen. Major cities fell in rapid succession, Córdoba in 1236, Seville in 1248. And by the middle of the 13th century, the map of Muslim-controlled Iberia had shrunk to a fraction of its former size. reduced from a territory that had once covered nearly the entire peninsula to a single defensible pocket in the south. By this point, nearly the entire peninsula had come under Christian rule. Nearly, but not entirely. In the far south, one final Muslim kingdom endured, the Emirate of Granada, ruled by the Nasrid dynasty. And it didn't just survive. It survived for another 2.5 centuries, longer than many entire dynasties elsewhere in Europe managed to last from founding to collapse. Granada managed this partly through skillful diplomacy, agreeing to pay tribute to the increasingly powerful Christian Kingdom of Castile in exchange for being left largely alone, and partly by taking advantage of the fact that the Christian kingdoms were, once again, more interested in fighting each other than in finishing the job. Granada's rulers proved remarkably adept at playing this position, at times even providing troops to help Castile in its own internal conflicts, using the arrangement to buy themselves decades of continued independence. During this long twilight, Granada became known for extraordinary architecture and craftsmanship. The Alhambra Palace complex, built and expanded during this period, remains one of the most celebrated works of architecture anywhere in the world. Its intricate tile work, carved archways, and reflecting pools still drawing millions of visitors more than 5 centuries after the kingdom that built it ceased to exist. The final chapter began in 1469. When the marriage of Ferdinand of Aragon and Isabella of Castile united the two most powerful Christian kingdoms on the peninsula under a single ruling partnership. With their combined resources and a shared singular goal, the so-called Catholic monarchs launched a sustained, decade-long campaign against Granada, the last remaining piece of a conflict that had begun 758 years earlier, methodically taking one fortified town after another rather than risking everything on a single decisive engagement. By late 1491, after years of steady military pressure, the city of Granada itself was surrounded, and its position had become hopeless. But the ending when it came wasn't a dramatic final assault. It was a negotiation. The Treaty of Granada set out generous terms for surrender, promises of religious tolerance, property rights, and safe passage for the Emirate's ruler, Muhammad XII, more commonly known by the name Boabdil. On the 2nd of January, 1492, Boabdil rode out of the city and formally handed over the keys of the Alhambra to Ferdinand and Isabella. No final charge, no last stand, just a formal handover, watched by soldiers on both sides who, in some cases, had spent their entire adult lives fighting a war that was, in that single quiet moment, simply over. The Reconquista, spanning 781 years from that first crossing in 711 to that quiet handover in 1492, had reached its end. Not with a decisive victory on a battlefield, but with the practical, almost bureaucratic transfer of one final city. Almost nothing in recorded history comes close to matching a war that lasted 781 years. To put that in perspective, the war began before the printing press, before gunpowder reached Europe, and before most of the modern nations of the world existed in any recognizable form. It outlasted the Carolingian Empire. It outlasted the original Caliphate that started it. Generations of families on both sides were born, lived their entire lives, and passed away without ever knowing a world where this conflict wasn't simply part of the background of daily life, as ordinary and unremarkable to them as any other feature of the landscape they grew up in. And yet, for all its length, the Reconquista wasn't one continuous battle stretching across 8 centuries. It was something messier and more human than that, long stretches of uneasy coexistence, broken by shorter bursts of conflict, shaped as much by marriages, treaties, and internal rivalries on both sides as by any battlefield. Kingdoms allied with their supposed enemies when it suited them and turned on their supposed allies just as readily. Cities changed hands not only through force, but through negotiation, inheritance, and the simple exhaustion of prolonged standoffs. It's a reminder that the longest wars in history are rarely simple stories of one side against another. They're stories about how long people can live alongside and against each other before something finally gives, and about how much of ordinary life can continue, generation after generation, even in the shadow of a conflict that never seems to end. If this kind of deep dive into history is what you're here for, make sure you're subscribed and let us know in the comments which long-forgotten conflict you'd want covered in more depth next.